January 1945. The winter wind cut through the skeletal trees surrounding the POW camp. Snow lay in uneven patches on the frozen ground, crunching under the hesitant steps of the prisoners. German women, uprooted from frontline towns, hospitals, and auxiliary units, moved silently. Their eyes, pale and wary, traced the fences topped with coils of ice-glinting barbed wire. A sharp order broke the quiet. Officers, clipboard in hand, moved deliberately through the formation. "Show us your feet." The command was simple, clinical, almost absurd. Yet for the women, it carried the weight of every indignity endured since the war had upended their lives. Cold toes, blistered heels, worn socks. They were asked to reveal the most human part of themselves under the scrutinizing gaze of armed authority. Confusion flickered across faces. Some froze, unsure whether compliance was safer than resistance. Others hesitated, glancing at their peers for guidance before reluctantly obeying. In that courtyard, the clash of authority and vulnerability was stark. Officers saw discipline. The women felt humiliation. Each movement was catalogued, judged, and recorded, while whispers of disbelief passed silently among the rows. The mundane act of showing one's feet became a lens into the machinery of war, how obedience, dignity, and control collided in the smallest, most personal ways. And as this story unfolds, chronicling fear, resilience, and the absurdities of wartime, it's a tale you won't want to miss. If you haven't already, subscribe to WWII Heroic Realism, so you never miss a moment of history brought vividly to life. That morning, the line between order and humiliation blurred. Beneath the snow and wind, the story of discipline, fear, and resilience began to unfold. A story that would reveal the human cost hidden in the strictest routines of war. By early 1945, Europe was a continent in upheaval. The Third Reich, once the unstoppable force of Nazi ideology, was crumbling under relentless Allied advances from the West and the Soviet Red Army from the East. Cities that had been centers of power were now ruins, their streets littered with debris, shattered vehicles, and the remnants of hastily abandoned military installations. Amid this chaos, the German civilian population became increasingly entwined in the war's machinery. Women, long kept away from front lines, found themselves drawn into auxiliary roles, nurses tending the wounded, clerks processing endless reports, and sometimes even combatants in last-ditch defensive units such as the Volkssturm. The capture of German women by Allied forces was comparatively rare, yet by 1944 to 1945, increasing numbers were taken as prisoners. They were often moved to temporary holding facilities before being transferred to permanent camps, a process designed to maintain order and prevent escapes. These camps, primarily located in France, Belgium, and the United Kingdom, adhered to Geneva Convention regulations but were still shaped by the logistical and psychological challenges of wartime detention. Sanitation, morale, and discipline were constant concerns. Commanders faced the dual responsibility of treating prisoners humanely while preventing the spread of disease and maintaining authority. Women POWs were subjected to a strict regime. Morning roll calls, medical inspections, work assignments, and periodic roll inspections were routine. Even the simplest of hygiene routines, washing, laundry, and foot care, became military exercises in control. Foot inspections, while appearing minor, were often mandated to prevent fungal infections and other illnesses that could spread rapidly in the crowded barracks. What seems unusual now was a practical wartime measure then. Commanders had learned through experience that small health violations could compromise entire camps, especially when winter cold and damp conditions threatened to weaken the prisoners' resistance. Life inside these camps was a study in contrast. On one hand, the Geneva Conventions required officers to provide adequate shelter, food, and medical care. On the other, the environment was controlled, regimented, and psychologically demanding. Guards were trained to enforce compliance, and deviations were rarely tolerated. For women who had not been the primary focus of POW management before, this created unique challenges. They were navigating a world structured entirely around rules they had never imagined applying to themselves, under the constant scrutiny of those who held life and death authority. The administrative mindset of camp leadership combined discipline with pragmatism. Officers documented every incident meticulously, from health violations to minor behavioral infractions. Hygiene inspections were designed to prevent outbreaks of lice, trench foot, or other wartime diseases. Foot inspections in particular were common during winter months when soldiers and civilians alike were prone to frostbite and fungal infections. The same procedures were applied to women POWs, though the reaction from prisoners was often more emotionally charged due to gender expectations, personal privacy, and social conditioning. Yet the background of these women was as varied as it was complex. Some were nurses who had tended to both German soldiers and civilians. Others were members of auxiliary military units, caught in the sweeping tides of retreat and surrender. Many had endured air raids, displacement, and the loss of loved ones. Their presence in POW camps represented not only a logistical challenge but a human one: how to apply military discipline to those whose war experience was more often civilian than martial, and whose personal dignity made compliance an emotionally fraught act. The stage was set for moments of tension that would later be remembered not for their strategic significance, but for the stark human reality they revealed. Orders that seemed trivial, inspecting boots, checking hygiene, or, in the case of this particular camp, examining feet, became symbols of power, authority, and vulnerability. The officers viewed these inspections as practical necessities, while the women experienced them as moments of exposure and uncertainty, where personal boundaries collided with military protocol. Winter continued to bite, and the barbed wire fences stretched endlessly across frozen fields. The officers moved with practiced efficiency, the women complied with hesitant precision, and the camp's routines persisted, a fragile semblance of order in a world unraveling outside the walls. Every inspection, every command, carried both administrative purpose and profound human impact. This was the environment in which the infamous morning order, to show their feet, would take on meaning far beyond its superficial intent, revealing the psychological, ethical, and emotional contours of wartime captivity. The camp was located on the outskirts of a small Belgian town, surrounded by snow-dusted fields and the skeletal remains of abandoned farmhouses. Wooden barracks, weathered and gray, stretched in neat rows, their roofs sagging under the weight of frost. Inside, the air was a mixture of smoke from stoves, damp wood, and the faint, persistent odor of unwashed clothing, a reminder of how cold and confined the winter months could be. The women, numbering just over 100, had been assigned to various duties: cleaning the barracks, preparing meals, sorting medical supplies, and maintaining camp hygiene. Yet even these mundane tasks were heavily regimented. Officers enforced strict schedules, recording lateness, monitoring performance, and inspecting work. Discipline was not merely about efficiency, it was about control. In the delicate ecosystem of a POW camp, even minor disruptions could cascade into health crises or breaches of authority. Medical inspections were routine yet intrusive. Nurses conducted checks for lice, infections, and frostbite, while officers observed to ensure compliance. It was during one such inspection, on a particularly bitter morning, that the unusual order was issued. Each woman was to remove her shoes and socks for examination. The officers cited practical concerns. Trench foot, fungal infections, and frostbite were common during the harsh winter months, and timely detection could prevent serious complications. For the women, the order felt anything but medical. To lift one's foot under the gaze of armed men, and to expose what was normally private, was a shock to personal dignity. Many hesitated, glancing at their peers for reassurance. Some obeyed stiffly, with clenched hands and tight shoulders. Others tried to make themselves appear smaller, attempting to preserve a sense of self in an environment designed to strip it away. What the officers saw as routine administration became, for the prisoners, a moment of vulnerability that revealed the sharp edges of power in daily camp life. The inspection itself was methodical. Officers moved row by row, checking soles, heels, and toes, noting any irregularities in health. Guards recorded compliance, marking minor infractions in their daily logs. In official reports, the order was described as a necessary precaution. Yet, through the eyes of the women, it was a moment that encapsulated the tension of captivity, the intersection of authority, necessity, and personal exposure. Outside the barracks, the world continued its relentless march. Allied forces were advancing on multiple fronts, and news of the Reich's collapse filtered through sporadically, carried by rumors, newspapers, and whispers. Within the camp, however, time seemed suspended. The daily rhythm, roll call, chores, inspections, and meals, was unbroken, a fragile continuity designed to maintain both order and morale. Every command, however mundane or strange, carried weight. Compliance was expected, defiance could be punished, and the consequences of illness or disorder were felt not just by the individual but by the entire community. In the midst of this environment, the seemingly trivial act of inspecting the women's feet became symbolic. It reflected the intersection of military pragmatism, the strictures of POW administration, and the psychological reality of subjugation. Officers saw hygiene and discipline. The women felt exposure and a loss of control. The tension between these perspectives would define not only that moment but also the broader human experience within the camp. The inspection ended, The rows of women retreated to their barracks, carrying with them the quiet residue of embarrassment and unease. The officers returned to their papers and routine, satisfied that regulations had been enforced. And yet, even in this small, controlled space, the clash between authority and dignity, between discipline and vulnerability, had left a mark that would echo in the memories of those who lived it, shaping the narratives they would recount long after the war had ended. From this quiet tension, the story moves into deeper angles. The human, tactical, and leadership perspectives that reveal how an unusual command could illuminate the complex realities of captivity and control during one of history's most brutal conflicts. The morning air was sharp, almost biting, as the women assembled in the courtyard. Snow and frost coated the uneven ground, and each breath hung in clouds, mingling with the scent of cold metal and wood smoke. Officers moved with practiced precision, clipboards in hand, their boots crunching in rhythm with the wind. For weeks, minor inspections had punctuated the monotony of camp life, but today's order carried a weight that was unusual, even by wartime standards. "Show us your feet," the commanding officer instructed, his voice carrying across the frozen yard. The words seemed to linger in the air longer than usual, each syllable reverberating with authority. The women stiffened. Some turned their faces downward, shielding their expressions. Others hesitated, a subtle trembling in their hands betraying anxiety. This was not just a hygiene check, it was a confrontation with control, a moment when compliance and vulnerability collided in a stark, unavoidable way. Row by row, the women removed their shoes and socks, their movements slow, deliberate, constrained by both the cold and the sharp awareness of being watched. Officers leaned in, examining every sole, heel, and toe. The process was clinical, meticulous, and unnervingly impersonal. Not a single expression passed unobserved. Guards took notes, marking health issues or minor infractions. What may have seemed trivial to the officers, calluses, frostbite, cracked heels, was to the prisoners a vivid symbol of power exercised over them, a reminder that every detail of their lives was subject to scrutiny. The women's emotions oscillated between fear, shame, and quiet defiance. Some lifted their feet with rigid formality, forcing themselves to obey while maintaining a semblance of dignity. Others could not hide the flush of embarrassment or the tension in their shoulders. The officers, trained to maintain authority without personal engagement, saw only compliance or deviation. The microcosm of the courtyard reflected a broader wartime hierarchy, those who gave orders and those who had no choice but to follow. The tension escalated when a young nurse, recently transferred from a medical unit near the Eastern Front, hesitated. She froze, lifting one foot only partially, uncertain whether the soles were sufficiently clean. The officer's gaze sharpened. For a brief moment, time seemed to suspend itself in the frostbitten air. Compliance was not merely expected, it was demanded. The nurse straightened, lifted her foot fully, and the officer nodded, satisfied. The incident passed, but the lingering apprehension rippled through the rows. Every woman had internalized the stakes. Hesitation, however small, was visible, and in this environment, visibility could be dangerous. Beyond the individual moment, the inspection revealed the practical calculus of camp life. Officers meticulously documented minor medical issues, frostbite, cracked skin, fungal infections, while ensuring the camp's routines continued uninterrupted. In the context of winter 1945, such diligence was not merely administrative, it was essential. Disease spread quickly in enclosed, overcrowded quarters. Hygiene lapses could incapacitate multiple prisoners at once, overburden medical staff, and disrupt the fragile equilibrium that maintained order. Yet in balancing these practical concerns, the human cost became evident: the prisoners' discomfort, humiliation, and the subtle erosion of autonomy. Outside the courtyard, the war continued its relentless progression. Allied artillery could be heard in distant towns, and the Red Army was pushing relentlessly from the east. Within the camp, however, the world was contained in wooden barracks, frostbitten yards, and the commanding gaze of officers. For the women, the morning inspection crystallized the tension of captivity. The mundane act of showing their feet, when framed by authority, cold, and exposure, became emblematic of their position, caught between obedience and personal dignity, between survival and the quiet assertion of self. As the inspection progressed, the officers maintained a steady, unyielding rhythm. Each foot was examined in silence, each movement catalogued. The women's initial shock gradually gave way to a resigned compliance, a mechanical obedience honed by months of captivity. Yet beneath this exterior lay a quiet resilience, the ability to endure, to comply without surrendering entirely to humiliation, and to navigate the delicate balance between submission and self-preservation. The morning drew on. The snow crusted underfoot, officers checked their logs, and the women returned to their barracks, carrying with them the quiet weight of exposure. Though the inspection was over, its impact resonated. It had revealed more than hygiene issues or minor medical concerns. It had laid bare the complex interplay of authority, compliance, vulnerability, and endurance, a microcosm of life under military control during the most desperate months of the war. By midday, the courtyard had transformed into a theater of quiet tension. Officers moved with deliberate efficiency, their presence both commanding and intimidating. Every action, every glance, was measured, reinforcing the implicit hierarchy of power. For the women, the initial shock of the order had evolved into a heightened awareness of scrutiny. Each foot lifted, each toe inspected, carried layers of emotion, vulnerability, unease, and the faintest trace of defiance hidden in posture or averted gaze. A ripple of unrest passed through the rows when an older prisoner, a former factory worker, hesitated. Her boots were damp, her socks threadbare. The officer's sharp, calculating eyes noticed immediately. A guard stepped forward, gesturing to the inspection log, silently reminding her that compliance was not optional. The woman straightened, lifting her foot with careful precision, though her knuckles whitened on the fabric of her coat. It was a subtle rebellion in the smallest possible form. Compliance without surrender, obedience threaded with silent endurance. This microcosm of tension was mirrored in every barrack, every row of women. Officers observed carefully, noting not just medical conditions but psychological responses, hesitation, flinches, and whispered murmurs. Their logs would later reflect only procedural compliance, but the undercurrents of human reaction were impossible to hide. Commanders understood that the inspection was more than a health measure. It was a tool of discipline, an assertion of authority meant to reinforce the structured order of camp life. The decision to conduct the inspection in such a meticulous, public manner was deliberate. Camp leadership knew that private checks might elicit less resistance, but also less visibility of compliance. By holding the inspection in the courtyard, under the eyes of both officers and fellow prisoners, they ensured that authority was not only enforced but observed. Fear and embarrassment became instruments of control. In this cold, frozen space, the ordinary act of exposing one's feet became a lesson in the mechanics of power: who commands, who obeys, and how obedience is silently monitored. As the inspection continued, minor incidents tested the boundaries of order. One young prisoner lifted her foot hesitantly, revealing cracked heels from the damp conditions. The officer paused, leaning in to examine more closely. He marked the detail in the log, ostensibly as a medical precaution, but the act carried a silent message. Compliance was expected, deviation would be noted. In that moment, the line between care and control blurred, a tension present throughout the camp's history but intensified by the peculiar circumstances of winter inspections. By mid-afternoon, the inspection had concluded. Officers returned to their papers, satisfied that regulations had been enforced, while guards resumed their patrols along the snow-crusted fences. Yet the women did not return to their barracks unchanged. The psychological impact was subtle but pervasive. Some huddled in small groups, whispering quietly about the morning's events. Others avoided eye contact, tracing the familiar lines of the barracks as if retreating into a private world. Compliance had been achieved, but dignity, even partially preserved, was marked by exhaustion and tension. The ripple effects extended beyond the inspection itself. Reports of minor infections were forwarded to medical staff, ensuring that foot care and hygiene would be addressed, while camp officers noted patterns of hesitation or noncompliance. These observations would influence the conduct of future inspections and inform the ongoing management of prisoners. In practical terms, the camp had maintained order. In human terms, the women carried an indelible memory of exposure, control, and resilience. Outside the camp, the war continued its unrelenting progression. Yet within these frozen boundaries, time was measured not by advancing fronts or crumbling cities, but by the meticulous routines of captivity. The seemingly absurd act of showing one's feet had crystallized the delicate balance of authority, obedience, and human endurance. It was a moment small in scale but vast in significance, revealing the subtle, often overlooked dimensions of life as a POW. As the women returned to their barracks, the officers filed away their logs, and the cold afternoon light deepened the shadows between the wooden barracks. The stage was set for the aftermath. The consequences of the inspection, both immediate and lingering, would ripple through the camp, influencing morale, discipline, and the human experience of captivity. And these effects would extend far beyond the snow-covered courtyard, echoing in testimonies, reports, and memories that endured long after the war had ended. The snow had begun to soften by late afternoon, the courtyard empty but still heavy with the memory of the morning's inspection. Inside the barracks, the women moved quietly, each step measured, their faces still pale with lingering tension. Though the officers had returned to their administrative tasks, the psychological imprint of the unusual command persisted. It was an event that required compliance but offered no comfort, a reminder that authority in a POW camp extended beyond orders and into the realm of personal dignity. Medical staff noted several minor cases of frostbite and cracked heels that had been identified during the inspection. Bandages were applied, ointments administered, and preventive measures reinforced. In official reports, the event was recorded succinctly: all prisoners had complied, hygiene standards met. Yet these clinical notations belied the deeper, more nuanced impact. The women carried with them a quiet humiliation, tempered by a survival instinct that demanded endurance. Every compliance was a negotiation between fear and resilience, obedience and dignity. Officers reflected on the inspection with a sense of practical satisfaction. The camp had maintained order, disease risk had been minimized, discipline had been visibly enforced. From a leadership standpoint, the procedure was a success. The microcosm of authority had functioned precisely as intended. Compliance was achieved, hierarchy reinforced, and records updated. Minor incidents, hesitation or subtle gestures of resistance, were noted, but no formal disciplinary actions were necessary. In their view, the balance between pragmatism and psychological impact had been carefully managed. For the prisoners, the aftermath was more subtle, though no less real. In the dim light of the barracks, whispered conversations emerged. Some spoke in hushed tones of the absurdity of the order, sharing brief accounts of their embarrassment and the fleeting defiance they had felt. Others remained silent, internalizing the experience, weighing the risks of speaking out against the imperative of survival. The inspection became a lens through which they measured not just their own resilience but also the structure of power that constrained every movement, every thought, and every decision within the camp. Daily routines resumed, yet the cadence of life had shifted. Tasks once mundane, the distribution of food, the cleaning of floors, the maintenance of bunks, were now shadowed by the memory of scrutiny. The women walked more deliberately, conscious of the eyes that might watch, the logs that would record every detail. In this way, the morning inspection became more than a singular event. It became a framework for understanding their place within the microcosm of the camp, a constant reminder that compliance carried both protection and personal cost. The officers, meanwhile, continued their rotation of inspections, medical checks, and administrative duties. Reports of fungal infections, frostbite, and minor hygiene lapses informed their daily routines, allowing them to preempt potential outbreaks. By enforcing compliance through both practical measures and the implicit assertion of authority, they maintained control over the camp's environment. Yet even they could not fully account for the quiet, intangible effects, the tension, the lingering embarrassment, and the subtle psychological endurance exhibited by the prisoners. In the wider context of the war, such events were rarely documented outside camp logs and medical reports. Newspapers and official histories focused on battles, troop movements, and territorial gains. Yet within the confines of the camp, the consequences of this inspection were deeply felt. The women's memories, the officers' records, and the subtle adjustments to routine were all evidence of how even the smallest orders could resonate profoundly. Hygiene inspections, intended to prevent disease, had become instruments of authority, shaping the mental and emotional landscape of captivity. By the evening, the camp had quieted. The women huddled in their bunks, performing the small rituals that brought comfort, folding clothing, writing letters, or simply sitting in silence. They had survived another day, yet the imprint of the morning lingered. For officers and guards, the day was a record of effective administration. For the prisoners, it was a reminder of vulnerability, endurance, and the quiet assertion of self in the face of imposed control. The inspection, seemingly trivial on paper, had revealed the fragile balance between authority and humanity, obedience and dignity. And as the camp settled into the long, cold night, the stage was set for the larger consequences, both psychological and historical, that would emerge in the following days and years. The weeks that followed the inspection unfolded quietly, yet the memory of that morning remained vivid in the minds of the women. Life in the camp continued with its regimented rhythm. Roll calls, chores, medical checks, and meals served under the watchful eyes of officers. Yet every routine carried a heightened awareness of scrutiny. For the prisoners, the simple act of compliance had become a constant negotiation: how to follow orders without surrendering the last fragments of personal dignity. Some women shared their experiences in hushed conversations, their words carefully chosen. They spoke of the absurdity of the order, of the invasive nature of showing their feet, of the strange mixture of fear and shame it evoked. These accounts were preserved in diaries, letters, and post-war testimonies. Historians studying the camp later noted that such small, seemingly trivial acts often left deeper psychological impressions than broader, more overt forms of discipline. The inspection had become symbolic of the tension between authority and humanity, a microcosm of captivity that extended beyond this single camp. Officers and camp administrators also reflected on the inspection, often in more practical terms. Reports emphasized compliance, hygiene, and prevention of disease, but subtly acknowledged that maintaining authority in a population unaccustomed to military discipline required constant vigilance. The inspection had reinforced the camp's hierarchy. Authority was not only administered through orders but also through observation, ritual, and psychological subtlety. Officers understood that the act of compliance itself, observed, documented, and repeated, was a tool for preserving order, morale, and health. The broader implications reached into post-war debates on prisoner treatment and Geneva Convention standards. Scholars and military analysts would later cite such inspections as examples of how POW camps balanced hygiene, discipline, and psychological impact. While the procedure adhered to regulations, it also highlighted the fine line between administrative necessity and personal intrusion. The ethical and moral questions raised by the morning's events would resurface in discussions of wartime conduct. How far could authority extend into the personal lives of prisoners? What constituted necessary discipline versus humiliation? These questions, though framed decades later, were already being lived in the barracks of that Belgian camp. For the women themselves, the lasting effects were both practical and psychological. Minor medical issues identified during the inspection were addressed, preventing potential complications from frostbite or fungal infections. Yet the experience also left a subtler mark: the understanding that survival in captivity required not only physical compliance but mental resilience. Endurance, discretion, and careful observation of authority became essential skills, just as vital as any practical knowledge of hygiene or health. Each woman carried with her a heightened awareness of vulnerability and control, a sensitivity to the smallest gestures of power that would linger long after the camp gates closed. The inspection also resonated within the post-war historical record, not as a major battle or political decision, but as a lens into the human experience of captivity. Researchers examining POW life noted that small, procedural acts, foot inspections, hygiene checks, mandatory routines, revealed the dynamics of authority, obedience, and dignity in a way that broader military actions could not. In the quiet discipline of the camp, the balance of fear and endurance, humiliation and resilience, became evident in the most personal and unexpected ways. By the end of winter, the camp continued its routines, officers continued their oversight, and the war moved inexorably forward. The morning inspection, brief and procedural, had left an indelible imprint on both prisoners and administrators. It was a testament to the complex reality of captivity, that power could be exercised in the smallest acts, that compliance could coexist with quiet resistance, and that the human spirit persisted even under the most controlled and humiliating circumstances. In this way, the inspection transcended its immediate purpose. It was more than a measure of hygiene. It was a reflection of wartime authority, an exercise in human psychology, and a moment that illustrated the delicate, often invisible balance between control and resilience. And from this moment, the narrative moves inevitably toward reflection, an examination of what such experiences tell us about humanity, war, and the enduring lessons of history. The courtyard was silent now, the echoes of orders and hesitant compliance long faded into memory. Yet for those who lived through it, the morning inspection remained vivid, a small, intimate moment in the vast machinery of war that revealed more about human resilience than any battle report ever could. It was a reminder that war is not measured solely in territory gained or lives lost, but also in the quiet endurance of those caught in its tides, the subtle negotiations of dignity, and the resilience that persists even under scrutiny. The inspection of feet, a seemingly trivial act, illuminated the broader dynamics of captivity. Authority, discipline, and hygiene intersected with vulnerability, fear, and personal dignity. For the officers, it was routine, necessary, and administratively sound. For the women, it was a moment of exposure, of navigating compliance while preserving self-respect. In that friction, history reveals the human cost of war beyond the battlefield, and the extraordinary strength required to endure it. Such events, often overlooked in traditional histories, remind us that even small moments can carry profound significance. The women who stood in that frozen courtyard did not wield weapons, but they demonstrated resilience, adaptability, and the quiet assertion of self under conditions designed to diminish it. Their experience echoes across time, offering insight into the psychology of captivity, the ethics of command, and the delicate balance between authority and humanity. In reflecting on this episode, we are reminded that history is shaped not only by grand strategies and sweeping campaigns, but by individual experiences, by the lives lived in the shadow of orders, by moments of vulnerability made visible, and by the strength found in endurance. It is a story of resilience, of authority tested and dignity preserved, and of the human spirit persisting even in the most controlled, dehumanizing circumstances. The frozen snow, the quiet barracks, the meticulous inspections, they all tell the same story. War is not only fought with weapons but also with the subtleties of control, compliance, and courage. And in remembering these moments, we honor both the history of conflict and the enduring humanity of those who lived through it. If this journey through history resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to WWII Heroic Realism for more detailed, cinematic stories of courage, endurance, and the untold experiences of World War II.